and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I have the extraordinary pleasure of actually being in the same space as Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. We've known each other now for 5 years. We've done probably 50 or more programs together. We have talked all that time. One of these days we'll meet, we'll have dinner. I'll come to Washington, you'll come somewhere. Of course, she's not coming to North Dakota, but that's fine. She has standards. But we'll meet and we'll have dinner and we'll make plans and so on. And so I'm so glad that you're here, Dr. Chervinsky.
I am thrilled to be here, and I will go to North Dakota. We just agreed it made more sense to wait for the Theodore Roosevelt Library to open.
And to go someplace where there might be an audience.
Helpful.
All right.
Helpful.
So, I want to say something about, we're going to do 10 things about the American Revolution.
Yes.
You nominate 10 subjects, I nominate 10 propositions, we work that out. All right. But here's why I love working with Lindsay. So there's a generational difference. I'm much older than Lindsay. And it's not just about age, it's about different ways of seeing American history. When I was going through my training, for example, Thomas Jefferson was riding high. He was the founding father. And even on the question of slavery, he was kind of given a pass. Some historians, there was kind of a Jefferson junta, Dumas Malone and Merrill Peterson and others, and they saw he was sort of an accidental slaveholder, and he was a benevolent slaveholder and so on. That was the orthodoxy in Jefferson studies. That has been completely reversed today. And today Jefferson's, the myth of Jefferson, the myth of the benevolent slaveholder is over, and I think over forever. And the new generation that you represent, I would say, have a disillusioned view of Thomas Jefferson, and often I think a very negative one. So that's one thing, I think, and that's about training. And it's really important that a new generation of scholars has broken the stronghold that Jefferson has had on early American history. That's one thing. The second thing is, Lindsay's a woman and I'm a man, and we bring different perspectives because of that. She's an Easterner, I'm a Plainsman. And so these create creative possibilities and tensions that I think are really important to what we do.
I agree. You know, as I've been talking about this, my Adams book over the last several months, one of the things that I often say is that we write history based on the questions we ask, because those questions will inform what sources we're looking at, how we're looking at them, how we are assessing them. And the questions we ask depend on what we have lived, because that informs how we are thinking about shaping those questions. And so our different, and it's not revisionist history, it's just everyone's gonna come at something in a different way. And so the different perspectives, I think, are essential to seeing things, same event, same set of facts, same characters, different stuff is gonna jump out at us, and that's a good thing.
Different lenses, different perspectives. And then one final thing, Lindsay is willing to use language, slang I call it, snarky language, and I kind of bristle, and she does it just to mess with me on the program.
Well, sometimes, per your event last night, which was excellent.
Event in Vail where we talked about language.
We talked about language. Sometimes slang is actually the best way to describe something. Mm-hmm. So my favorite example that I've done on this podcast, and every time I think about it, I start chuckling, so I'm going to start laughing as I tell the story. I can't remember, I think we were maybe talking about Hamilton and Jefferson and like political skills. And I used the phrase game recognizes game.
I did backflips out of the studio. You know.
No, what happened is you're like, what? You're like, I don't understand. So I had to explain it to you, and it just makes my heart sing. It's so funny.
Yeah, great. So let's start, shall we? 10 things about the American Revolution. I'm going to choose one of yours first.
Okay.
10 things. Lexington and Concord.
Yes, so the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, the 250th anniversary, is coming up in just a few short weeks. And I selected this one because I always think of this as the kicking off point, the starting point of the American Revolution. Now, of course, some people are going to talk about the Stamp Act or the Tea Party or any of those things. And I think those are very important lead-up moments to the revolution. But if we're talking about the Revolutionary War in particular, the effort to win independence, Lexington and Concord is, I think, the point at which there is no return. And many of the figures, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams used one of his favorite phrases afterwards, which is the die is cast, saying that this is basically the point at which you cannot come back from it.
And Jefferson's view all along this period was, we can work this out, we'll reconcile, we would love to remain subjects of Great Britain as long as they treat us as real citizens and so on. That was partly a bit of strategy and posturing, but nevertheless, he was not eager for a revolutionary war. But after Lexington, he said, it's over. Now we have no choice. The war has begun. They brought the war to us. Now we have to see it through. And so this really is an important marker, but it's also extremely deeply embedded in American memory. Emerson's poem, By the Rude Bridge That Arched the Flood. You've been to the site.
I have, yeah, we were talking about this earlier. I had the good fortune a couple of years ago, by accident, on Constitution Day. I was there and happened to walk along what is now called Battle Road, but was then called Old Concord Road at the time. And it's now a National Park Service site, and it's been wonderfully maintained. And is so valuable because when you actually see the trees and the walls and the fences and how close the houses were to the site of battle, it gives you such a good sense of the intimacy, the smallness of the experience, how terrifying it would have been for the British soldiers to be marching back to Boston and having people firing at you from positions you can't imagine. But I think it also embeds in, the preservation of that space. To your point about American memory, those living spaces are so essential to continuing to allow those to flourish in our American memory, and so much about Lexington and Concord that we remember, things like the shot heard round the world. That actually wasn't said until much, much later.
Emerson, a generation later.
Yes, and he was the one that really made famous, I think he's the one that really made famous the one if by land, two if by sea.
This is about Paul Revere later.
Yes, which of course was accurate, but it wasn't necessarily a part of the story until later. And so the continued shaping of its role in American history over many decades has only made it, I think, more important to our story of the American Revolution.
And being there, so being at Gettysburg and walking Gettysburg, being at the Little Bighorn in Montana, being on the Lewis and Clark Trail where they actually had a meeting with the Nez Perce, for example, those are extraordinarily valuable things. And we're good at that in the United States, at making national monuments and national parks of these places.
We are, and I think it's great big moments like battles, but it's also daily lives. So, I think that's why preserving historic homes, and of course I'm obviously speaking from a place of bias because I now work at Mount Vernon, and I think the historic homes are so important, but it allows people, especially children, to actually see historic lives as 3D. It allows them to actually understand that these figures were real. Even those children with the very best of imagination, sometimes reading doesn't quite do it. And so if you can see where they lived, it helps those people come alive for them.
So you are the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon.
I am.
Mount Vernon, that sort of second-rank house. It's not a Palladian, it's not Monticello. It's kind of, and he didn't even really design it. He kind of inherited it and added on to it.
Thank goodness for everyone living in it. It was actually a comfortable place to live.
Oh, you're saying that, wow, wow. If you got the choice to live in Monticello or Mount Vernon, you would choose Mount Vernon?
Well, so are we talking about if I'm Thomas Jefferson or
no, if you're Lindsay Chervinsky?
Well, okay, but so the reason I asked that question is I think Monticello was a wonderful place for Thomas Jefferson to live. I think it was a terrible place for his children and grandchildren to live.
Because it's cramped and the
spaces were not designed for them. It was designed for his comfort.
It was designed to show the world what Palladian order looks like.
For listeners, first eye roll.
First eye roll.
Number one.
And when we're doing this on Zoom, I start weeping, gnashing my teeth. I've been in therapy. This we'll just go on. We'll just go on. Let's move from that.
I want to put that back on you though. Okay, so let's say you're not George Washington and you're not Thomas Jefferson, because obviously the masters of the plantation are going to have the best
of course
quarters. Which one would you want to live in if you weren't them?
I still like a dome.
It was a totally impractical room. It didn't do anything.
Have you ever been in the dome?
I have been.
And I go up in there and it's empty. You can't see out
the windows, and it's hot.
There are lunettes and there are wasps, but you go in and you just feel like
such a good company.
You feel like symmetry and orderliness. That the universe is a cosmos.
I feel hot.
All right, that's enough. let's move on to another one from but this is related.
Okay.
To Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve, 1776.
Yes. So the crossing of the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton while they have enormous, enormous significance in our American memory of the Revolution and have been made famous by the painting which she...
Surprise attack on the
Yes.
British troops.
What I think is actually important for the history of the Revolution is that the American army was disintegrating and was about to completely run out of troops because their enlistments were about to expire and they were all planning to go home. They had just lost the port of New York City, which was probably the most valuable port at the time. They had had a series of pretty embarrassing defeats over the summer in which Washington got incredibly lucky that he was not killed or captured.
We came this close to losing the war.
This close to losing the war. It was really a last-ditch effort to try and do something to keep the hope of independence
And build
alive.
morale.
Build morale among the troops, get them to maybe re-up their enlistments, get Congress to call for more enlistments from other troops. But also American morale was really important. You had to have a symbolic victory. So the battles themselves were not all that strategically important. It's not like we won this huge port or a city or a weapons depot, but it was a victory when we desperately needed one. It was a surprise attack which demonstrated that we were capable of doing that. And I did demonstrate, I think, the bravery of Washington and his forces in crossing the river such that the cause of independence could live on beyond 1776. And so I think it is a key pivotal turning.
All right, so let me go to one of my propositions here. Your man, George Washington, was not a great general, in my opinion, in the way of Napoleon or Julius Caesar, but he managed to hold the ragtag armies together through the darkest moments of the war, and in a sense we outlasted Britain's capacity to want to wage war against us. Is that fair?
I agree. He was not a brilliant battle tactician. He was not necessarily super creative in terms of his strategy like Napoleon was. What he was really good at was understanding the overall goal of the army and his relationship to it.
Lindsay, how fascinating. I have more questions to ask you about Washington, including the Conway Cabal, but also the end of the war. But we need to take a break, so let's take a quick break. Stay tuned, everyone. You're listening to a very special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm sitting next to Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of two spectacular books. I first encountered her work in her book on the cabinet, and George Washington essentially invented the presidency. There wasn't enough in the Constitution to really explain how a president should operate, and Washington had to decide how to do these things. The cabinet is sort of slightly hinted at in the Constitution, but he decided to make it what it now is. Of course, there were only 2 or 3 or 4 members back in the early national period. Now I think it's over 20. That's 15.
I think there are 16 departments.
Soon to be less.
There, indeed, well, Congress decides how many departments there are. Whether or not they will uphold that responsibility is a different story altogether. And then there are a number of other positions that are cabinet level at the president's discretion.
And Lindsay's second book, more recent, is about John Adams and the creation of, I would say, making sure that the presidential tradition and the early national period had a solid continuance after the departure of the great Washington.
Yes, well said.
Thank you. I read your book. Somebody had to.
You read it carefully.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back. One of the things I find most amusing about this, and I know how much you love Washington, is that the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, and they have to go to war. And so they're looking around, they're thinking, well, we should have a commander, or someone's going to have to lead our troops. And through the door walks George Washington in uniform. He walks in uniform into the Second Continental Congress saying, I don't know if you've found someone to command the army yet, but oh, look. I feel like there's something wrong with this story. Because remember, he's American Cincinnatus.
Let me start from the beginning. I would actually quibble with your description that I love Washington. I think I have a lot more affection for Adams. I have tremendous respect for Washington.
All right.
But I think because he intentionally kept people at bay through a number of various mechanisms, including asking Martha to burn all of their correspondence. It's really hard to love someone if you can't actually get to know them. So just had to put that out there.
You love your man, John Adams.
I do, but I don't think that love is one. I mean, I'm very keenly aware of his flaws.
And you write about it candidly in your book.
I think it's more of an affection that's born from seeing the 3D.
He's easier to like.
Yeah. So back to the uniform. Back to the uniform. Okay. So as the Second Continental Congress is gathering, it's very clear that there's going to be a war. It's very, Lexington and Concord happens. They have to decide what they want to do. This should not just be a militia of northern states, because this is they didn't quite think of themselves as a national project yet, but it was supposed to be a unified effort. And so there were 3 factors that they had to keep in mind. One, they did not want someone from Massachusetts being the commander, because again, it needed to be a unified national effort.
They were perceiving that might be regarded as a regional tax rebellion, and it needed to be a national response.
Exactly. 2, the person had to be born in North America, what became the United States, because that person's loyalty needed to be unquestioned. And as part of that loyalty being unquestioned, that the person needed to have not been an officer in the British Army. And here's where Washington's earlier frustrations about not getting an official commission actually were quite useful. The person, I suppose, also had to have military experience, but that was sort of a given. So if we take those factors into account, there actually weren't that many people that they were considering.
It's a small gene pool here.
Small gene pool, because Horatio Gates, for example, was a very experienced officer, but he had actually been in the British Army. So, relatively small gene pool, yet nonetheless, Washington did show up in his military uniform.
And he had been in retirement, so he's a civilian.
Yes.
So it's not on active service, and he suddenly appears in a military, I'll call it costume. That seems a little ambitious to me.
It was a helpful reminder, just in case anyone forgot, that he had military experience.
And he touched off the French and Indian War, thank you very much.
He also did some other good things.
Yeah.
What I think is so interesting about this moment is this is where we start to see, actually not really start to see, he had demonstrated a flair for this earlier. He had a great read for the dramatic, a great read for the symbolic, and the importance of theatrical gestures when done well and sparingly and carefully. There are several moments where he does this quite well. The Newburgh conspiracy is one of them. But this moment where he wears his uniform is one of those moments, and I think is quite entertaining.
But let me be serious about it for a moment, so I'm sort of playing with you about this. But remember when Alexander Haig said, "I'm in charge," and everyone ridiculed him because he wasn't really in charge, and that kind of performance of putting yourself over the edge too quickly can really come back to bite you. But Washington did it, and it didn't hurt him. So let's jump ahead to the Newburgh conspiracy, just because it's so much more interesting because of the drama.
Yes.
So this is after the war. Officers and others have not been paid.
Well, it's still it's after Yorktown, but the Treaty of Paris hasn't been signed yet.
But the war's effectively over. And a group of officers are like, "Hey, we're not disbanding until we get paid." And there's rumblings of sort of mutiny, and this is all getting stirred up. And suddenly, as this conversation is going on, in walks the great George Washington. Take it from there.
So the Army hadn't been fighting since 1781. This was in March of 1783. They had been in New York, outside of New York City, where Washington could kind of keep an eye on the remaining British forces and make sure they didn't sort of re-up the battles, but not necessarily engage with them. And he had this army that had nothing to do for 2 years. And anytime you have a group of young men and they have nothing to do, that can cause problems, especially when they were not being paid. And so the officers started to discuss various ways that they could make Congress pay them, including marching on Congress, maybe overturning Congress. There were sort of various gradations within this concept about how much pressure they were willing to put on the civilian body overseeing the military.
And by the way, Lindsay, this is how many wars end, that there's no disbanding, that the Napoleon figure then takes over and the civilian government is disbanded.
Yes.
So this was a very critical moment.
Yes, this is how you get military coups. And critically, Washington and a lot of the others were students of history, so they understood this pattern. They understood that this was always the threat to an end of a war.
So the door opens.
So Washington learns that the officers are to meet. And he initially tells them not to meet, and then he schedules the meeting, he shows up. He pulls an address out of his pocket.
To read.
To read. He starts to read and then sort of stumbles and pulls a pair of spectacles out of his jacket, spectacles.
So here's the great Washington wearing glasses, which was not regarded as
You didn't do
heroic.
that in public company at the time. It was considered to be poor form to put on glasses in front of others. And he apologized and said, "Forgive me, I have gone blind and gray in the service of my country."
So the whole crowd starts weeping.
So the officers start crying.
And the mutiny is over. What an actual great performance.
Now the part of the story that is not often told is that as he's walking in and he's sort of using his deft theatrical skills, this is the peak of his theatrical moments, he also has Henry Knox standing at the door, who's the general of artillery.
And he's huge.
And he has the entire artillery corps standing outside the door.
And just in case.
Just in case. So he had the stick if he needed it, but he didn't ever have to appeal to the stick. What's amazing about this moment, so it does disband the threat of military coup. 2 weeks later, he wrote a letter to Theodoric Bland, who was a member of Congress, and it's an 11-page letter in his hand, which was very unusual for the war. And he wrote about his feelings.
Because normally he dictated to others.
He dictated to secretaries because he had so much correspondence to do. So
and Hamilton was often that person.
Yes. So he writes in his own hand, and he is expressing his concern for the army, his desire to disband it safely, to ensure that they're paid, to make sure that their sacrifices were warranted. It's an amazing letter. The library bought it.
You have it.
I have it. We bought it in the fall. It's an 11-page
it must be something
letter.
you get to hold.
Oh, it's spectacular. And it's his signature at the end, at the top, up on the front page. It says, headquarters at Newburgh. So if you ever come to the library, it is.
You'll give us the tour?
I will give you the tour, and this letter is
We're counting on it because there are
favorites.
only like 500,000 listeners to this program.
There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So, but when I think of this incident, and of course I'm making fun of it now, but I think of Hamilton as before they come in the room saying, "You're going to do the blind glasses trope again?"
Well, so, interestingly, historians are not totally clear what Hamilton's role in this was.
Because Hamilton is kind of on both sides
He's on
of the
both
story.
sides. He's both.
Well, gee, go figure. Hamilton not
Who
entirely.
would have thought?
Yeah.
He both was sort of stirring up the officers, but also then was one of the people who let Washington know that maybe it got out of hand, maybe it got past where he wanted. So then he goes and tattles to.
But he's going to hedge his
down.
bets, see which side is in the ascendancy here.
Exactly.
That's one reason why I just can't like Hamilton, because this isn't the only time in his life where he's doing the sort of deeply duplicitous stuff, toying with coup d'etat.
You don't like duplicitous behavior?
And Jefferson wasn't capable of it.
Let's put a pin in that for later.
So just leave it alone. We're going to debate tonight about the indispensable founding father. I think you would say, button it.
Button.
That's exactly. That's what we learned last night. All right, so let's go to a related topic. Now we'll talk a little bit about Mr. Jefferson. My view is that if Jefferson hadn't written the Declaration of Independence, it would not be the famous, immortal, world-class thing that we all so deeply revere. That whatever you say about Jefferson, this was what he was so great at. He was able to put in this tense, firm, cogent language, the aspirations of humanity. John Adams couldn't have done that. Madison couldn't have done that. Washington couldn't have done that. That this is Jefferson's particular genius. And the document at the time was sort of seen as, announce to the world that you're going to do this and you're looking for a French alliance. Mm-hmm. Don't you agree that this is Jefferson at his very best?
I think Jefferson at his very best is the Declaration of Religious Freedom.
That's 1786.
Yes.
That's the second thing on his tombstone.
So I think that is his very best.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Arguably the 35 most important words in American life, because we've gone back to it a zillion times.
Yes, they are beautiful, extraordinary words.
And?
There's no and.
Well, there is an and, because
There's
a man who owns up to 600 enslaved people and never frees more than 8 is going to be accused of inconsistency and maybe gross hypocrisy if you write that.
True. I think I have always seen the Declaration of Independence as a statement of our aspirational principles.
Universal principles which we may not actually enact.
We never have fully realized
to this
them.
day.
To this day. And I always see the Constitution as part 2 of trying to create a more perfect union based on those principles. Not a perfect union, a more perfect union. And each generation that returns to them is trying to create it, is trying to make it slightly more perfect.
For many, Jefferson's hypocrisy on this question is sort of terminal. Like, no, I can never take Jefferson seriously because you can't say that and then own and buy and sell enslaved people, that this is really now in our time a kind of fundamental deal breaker on Jefferson, and that yes, of course he's important in some other ways, but we can never really admire him at full tilt ever again. How do you see that?
Well, I think this gets back to your opening about our different trainings and our perspectives on history. You know, one of the first books I was assigned in graduate school was Annette Gordon Reed's Hemmings and Monticello.
A brilliant book.
Absolutely extraordinary, totally changed how I thought about evidence and how you assess things, how you think about human agency.
Annette Gordon Reed, The Hemmings Family of Monticello.
Yes. So that's the, you know, and I obviously had read books about Jefferson prior to graduate school, but that was the first time I was in a graduate school setting seriously analyzing a text about Jefferson, and that's the base layer. I think, in some ways, I think it actually gets at 2 different questions of Jefferson. One is this person someone of impact? Is this person someone that had great influence? And we're trying to measure their influence on the world and on history. The second question is, what do we think of him as a person? And that is always the complicated question of history. It's always the complicated question of biography, because no person is perfect and everyone has their flaws in various ways. And there are some things that I think, you know, he was born into a plantation owning family. He was born to and immediately basically willed dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved individuals.
His first memory was of being carried on a pillow on top of a horse from one plantation to another, about, I think, 50 miles away. And the person carrying this 2-year-old child was a trusted black enslaved man. And so this is a really, really, really complicated business. And there are no easy ways to think about this.
No, and so I think it is appropriate to say, very limited ways, he was a man of his time, and that's what the world he was born into. However, the other people at his time, including the Marquis de Lafayette, and of course the enslaved people who resented and pushed back against this institution every day in small and major ways, recognized the evilness of slavery and urged him to do something about it, and he didn't.
So 2 things about that, and then we'll let it go. We talk about it a lot, because you can't not. One is that you hear all the time, they were men of their times, they were people of their times. Presentism, we shouldn't judge people from long ago by current standards, and you hear this every single day of your life, right? And you want to say, yes, but.
Yeah, what I say is, it is very important when we're assessing the time that we don't just factor in the white plantation slave-owning men. We have to factor in the people who were abolitionists, even early on, who took different actions, like George Washington. Although he did not do everything he could, he also emancipated over 100 individuals that he legally had control over in his will upon the death of Martha. So other people were doing different things. So I think we have to include a lot of different people when we're assessing what time was. What the time provides to us that I think is useful is a better understanding of how intricately interwoven slavery was with every facet of life. So it wasn't just about growing crops. It was, you know, let's say you were anti-slavery. If you were in Philadelphia, John Adams never owned someone. He intellectually objected to the concept of slavery, and yet every time he went to the president's house when Washington was president, an enslaved person probably took his coat and brought him food and took care of his horses. And so he was benefiting from enslaved labor, even in a city that was increasingly abolitionist. So it is interwoven in a way that is important for us to comprehend when we're thinking about what we are asking of them. Just how complicated and messy it was, which is not an apology. It's complicated.
But the complexities are worth dwelling on.
They are.
The second thing that I wanted to say was that Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment, and he prided himself deeply on being a man of the Enlightenment. Most of his friends were abolitionists. So James Price, Joseph Priestley, Lafayette. And one of the most amazing things about Jefferson, Lindsay, I think, is that there was some sort of a tacit understanding that you don't confront Jefferson on this question. No matter what they said outside of Jefferson's presence or in their correspondence and so on, when you're with Jefferson, you never say, how can you really do this? And this is a really interesting power he had to prevent certain types of conversations.
So can I ask you a historical what if there? Because often what we know about what happened in the past is, of course, based on the records that we have, based on what either letters survived or how people described conversations. Do we know that they didn't talk to him about it? Or did they talk about it and maybe it went so badly that they never wanted to mention it again and so they didn't write about it?
We don't have recordings, of course.
Yeah.
And people didn't go away and say, boy, I shouldn't have brought that up.
Yeah.
You know,
I wonder if they were so chagrined, though, because of his reaction that they didn't want to talk about it.
I don't think so, because, you know, he went into what I call the Jefferson music. I love this concept of the Jefferson music. They say, if they said something like, what a pity that our noble experiment has to accommodate this institution of slavery. That's when Jefferson says things like, nothing is more certainly in the book of faith than that these people must and will be free. Nobody believes more than I do in this. And if there were any practical way to do that, he had that kind of capacity to sing that kind of song about high principles and great integrity. And it worked. It was his genius. It was his special power. We need to take a break, Lindsay. This is so much fun. And a live audience putting up with this. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to ask you a few more questions about the Revolution. Welcome back, everyone, to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I'm with my dear friend, Lindsay Chervinsky, and it is such fun doing this with you, whether we're across the country on Zoom or whether we're in the same room now. We'll be doing more together live programs. We'll be debating in Vail tonight about which is the indispensable founding father. We'll be meeting in Weems, Virginia soon to talk about the Bill of Rights, I believe.
I think we're focusing heavily on the First Amendment, but that's part of the Bill of Rights.
Really? Yeah, who knew? All right, Lindsay, so you have this list. You nominate something to talk about.
Well, it's so interesting because this list, it shows how we think about things differently. I was like, okay, I'll pick the 10 key events, and you
Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris.
Yeah. And you chose sort of 10 propositions, which I think is so fascinating. One of the ones that I think that we should absolutely discuss is Thomas Paine's common sense. Right,
so Thomas Paine, born in Britain, flees, comes to the US, immediately gets himself involved in the revolutionary conversation. And he writes a pamphlet, it's really just a pamphlet. And I think Benjamin Rush tells him that the right title is Common Sense. Benjamin Rush, yes, signer of the Declaration, the great physician, also the medical advisor to Lewis and Clark. And Rush says, publish it as Common Sense, like everyone will realize this is true. This pamphlet comes out, I think 500,000 copies were sold within a year. If you think about the printing press of that era, that's unbelievable. Insane. The question is, in American mythology, this is like one of the precipitating events of the Revolution. This is one of the things that galvanized public opinion about this. What say you?
I think that's a bit of an overstatement. I mean, I do think that it was important and it was valuable, and I'll explain why in a moment. But again, for our conversation, when it came out in the spring of 1776, the war had been going on for a year at this point. And Congress had already created the Continental Army, had already appointed Washington as commander-in-chief of it, and a number of measures to resolve the tensions with Great Britain had failed. And so Congress was moving decisively towards independence. Where I think the impact is most notable is that it wasn't written for Congress. It was written for the American people. And it was written in what we would consider to be, sort of average parlance.
Plain language.
Yeah, plain language. It was designed to be read by the working class.
No great rhetoric, no Ciceronian sentence structure.
That. You did not need to be well educated to understand the argument he was making, because he made the argument in such a way that it was designed to appeal to the daily lives of average Americans. And it was designed to be very easily read aloud at taverns or in family hearths.
And it was
because not everyone was literate. And so the way a lot of news was shared was someone would get the pamphlet and then read it to the people around them. And I do think it did spark, especially in urban spaces, a little bit of a uprising of conviction, which, as we know, impacts our representatives. And that was true in 1776, and it's true today, that when the American people start to voice things in a certain direction, that influences the people in government. And so I think that it's kind of the final push that pushes the American people and pushes Congress over the line.
Some historians have said that it was read to Washington's troops. True or not?
I believe so. And I think that if I'm remembering my facts correctly, Washington then hired Paine as what we would consider to be like an embed reporter.
A communications officer.
Yes, exactly. And had him write reports about the troops and the army and had them published in newspapers.
And that's where he also had other pamphlets that were extremely important for morale building at the time, less well known today. So I think he called George III the royal brute of England. You know, he had that kind of capacity to get right down into the trench.
Well, and it's sharp, it's incisive, and it's not a high-minded insult.
In Latin, the word for head is caput, and when Louis XVI was beheaded, Paine said, Louis Capet, their last name was Capet. Louis Capet has lost his caput. That's like a revolutionary joke. Speaking of revolutionary jokes, you're laughing.
I am laughing.
It's fun though, isn't it?
I enjoy a good revolutionary pun.
You got any others?
No, I'm really bad at jokes, actually.
But I have one that you'll love to talk about. So in 1776, when the war was going so badly, the Continental Congress sent a delegation to meet with George Washington, I think on Long Island. Mm-hmm. And John Adams, who was sort of the head of the War Commission in Congress,
Board of War,
went with Dr. Franklin, the famous, the world celebrity, the first person who really understood electricity, member of the Royal Society, Benjamin Franklin, a universal genius of a certain sort, and they went off to meet with Washington. And they wound up, I think it's in Paterson, New Jersey, and they went to an inn, and they unfortunately did not have enough rooms, and so Adams and Franklin have to sleep not only in the same room, but in the same bed. Mm-hmm. The question is, what could go wrong?
Well, which was actually fairly common traveling practice
right?
At the time, because you couldn't call ahead and reserve a room at the local hotel. If you had to pick a moment in American history, would this be the one that you would like to be a fly on the wall?
I'd like to be on a little cam, a spy cam in the corner, because Adams is rotund, and Franklin
Although
is
at that point,
big.
he wasn't that rotund.
But they are a very unusual, odd couple. Yes. Let's put it that way.
Yes. I actually think that physically they were fairly similar. They were not particularly tall. They were both a little bit stocky, but their personalities could not have been more different. And they were like oil and water. And
I don't want to get too deep into the gross weeds about these things, but sheets were not always cleaned or changed.
No. Regularly had like bed bugs and lice.
This is not a pretty picture, and traveling in this era was a nightmare. And so they're assigned to the same room, and I'm sure that they were not particularly pleased by that. Mm-hmm. It feels like a scene out of Don Quixote to me. They get there, and it's time for bed.
Mm-hmm. And there's discussion about what to be done with the window, because there were different prevailing medical theories about how diseases were transmitted between different individuals. And so they didn't have germ theory. They didn't understand that the bite of mosquitoes caused certain things, but they did understand that it seemed to have something to do with being in the air. And so today we would understand that that's either, particles, like saliva particles or something that you are breathing, or bugs.
No screens on the windows.
No screens on the windows. So Adams said that they should keep the door closed because they were worried about having bad air come in, which was a common thought at the time. And Franklin said, no, the air must be open the window must be open because you need to have fresh air. Fresh air is good for health. And they apparently debated back and forth so long that Adams finally fell asleep, and Jefferson and Franklin won.
Franklin wins with the open window, but I just would have loved to see this scene. And the thing about your man Adams is that he had an exquisite sense of humor.
Yes.
Jefferson, almost none.
Yeah.
Adams writes about this in a marvelous way, and he says, Franklin was going on in a dissertation about the value of open windows when I finally fell asleep.
Adams does really have, he had a great sense of humor, and he had a great sense of humor about himself, which I really appreciate because I like that. I like self-awareness and historical figures, and I like when they can be self-deprecating.
And he saw the comedy in this moment. He realized from anyone looking at this can only find this deliciously funny.
Well, especially because they were congressmen, they were on an official visit, and they're going to deal with this very serious matter in the middle of the war, and if they lose, they're probably going to be hung as traitors, and they're arguing about the window.
And Franklin is a much bigger figure at this point in terms of international reputation.
Yes.
And Adams is like the junior partner here.
Yes, and refuses to be deferential.
So one of my propositions is, okay, it's the American Revolution. Yes, we get it. But Abigail Adams and Mary Wollstonecraft in England both wrote about this and said, in what sense is it a revolution if you liberate white males and don't remember the ladies? And as you know, Abigail Adams wrote a famous letter in the spring of 1776 to her husband and saying, now that you are going to declare an independency, I suppose you're going to write a constitution. And I ask you this time to remember the ladies. It's a great letter.
For all men would be tyrants if they could.
For all men would be tyrants if they could. She's punning all human beings, but also all males.
Yes. And so her letter is not necessarily saying that women should have equal rights as men, although I think she would have liked that. Her main complaint was about the concept of coverture, which was a legal designation that basically erased women from the legal space. So if you were a daughter, you were the property of your father. If you were a wife, you were the property of your husband. And you couldn't own any property in your own right. You couldn't transact anything. You couldn't exchange money or goods. And so when John Adams was in Europe for almost a decade, and she was primarily responsible for their estates and their finances, in order to buy land, she had to have one of her male family members conduct the transaction for her, even though she was way better at all of the financial stuff than any of them, and regularly had to give them loans because she was so much better at it than they were. So she was really talking about trying to just give women a legal space to exist under the law. But it gets at a very important point, which is that the American Revolution, if it is a revolution, is a very conservative one. The people who were in charge at the colonial level were largely the people in charge before and after the war. Washington was in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Washington was president after the war. And so we borrowed a lot from common law in terms of the British system and amended it, but that was sort of the basic system of laws. We have a very similar financial system. Our society did not undergo a whole lot of upheaval and certainly did not have the same sort of violence of the French Revolution of essentially trying to kill off an entire class of people. And so it is a very conservative movement in regards to changing a society.
It's a changing of the guard, but not a great social revolution.
Yes, and I would argue actually that's why it was successful long term, is because incremental change is much more likely to hold than radical change. There tends to be a backlash against radical change, but incremental change is much more tolerable.
So she writes this letter. John Adams replies.
He does. He's a little dismissive.
Quite dismissive.
He makes some jokes out of it. But I think what's certainly interesting is that when he was out of the country, he did hand over all of these decisions to her, and then when he came back, he didn't take it back because he recognized her skill and her intellect and her ability. So he may have been dismissive in this letter, but she was certainly an equal in all things in their marriage.
But he says things like, "You make me laugh." He said that I never thought we would have a revolution from the distaff side, from the female side of the bed. He said, rather than put up with this, George Washington and others and I would fight. No, he's being playful. But I think the translation is he just didn't get it.
Well, I'm not sure that he didn't get it. I think he turns it into a joke about like a rebellion within the household as opposed to a rebellion within the nation. But I think that he absolutely understood what, my guess is this is not the first time they had that conversation.
Or the last, if
I had to guess. And I think what he recognized, and he probably said in those other conversations, is that when you have moments of change, it needs to be incremental. And they were willing to make the choice that they would provide more rights for white men and not for others. And we have seen that happen time and time again. There was a similar debate that occurred in the 1860s and 1870s with the post-Civil War amendments that talked about not abridging right on the basis of race. And they intentionally removed sex from that amendment because they understood they wouldn't be able to get support from enough people if they included both race and sex.
And just to be clear about this, once the revolution succeeds, the citizen who can vote or hold public office is a white male of a certain property base, and different historians have come up with different percentages, but about 10 to 15% of the white male population is a voting citizen. Very briefly, women in New Jersey, once in a while free blacks, but for the most part, this is a very conservative revolution for what we would call white privileged men.
Yes, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, in Pennsylvania in the election of 1796, there were less than 20,000 voters.
So that, when we think of democracy, they did not, most of them, feel that that was a good idea.
No, I mean, democracy would have, the way that they thought of democracy is not representative. It was that everyone would have a voice and everyone would vote on everything. That's what a true Greek democracy was. And so they were trying to create a representative system where certain individuals were selected to represent the interests of the people, and who got to decide who those representatives were evolved over time.
So the will of the people matters, but it is distilled through a small minority of responsible agents who will listen to that will, but not always succumb to it.
Yes.
Let's do one more quickly, and that is Jefferson. And this is one of my propositions.
Oh, quickly, no. Jefferson, absolutely.
This is, but I'm being hard on him. You may be less hard on him. He was the governor of Virginia during the darkest period of the war in Virginia. The war came home to Virginia twice during his governorship. These were short-term governorships. He was not a particularly able governor. He was administratively brilliant, as usual. But when the war came to Virginia, he sort of panicked a little bit. And he was then investigated by the House of Delegates for malfeasance. And eventually, because the war ended, they kind of shrugged it off and stopped thinking about it. But this wounded him deeply, and he later said in a letter to James Monroe, one of his proteges, that the wounds that he had received would stay with him forever to the all-healing grave. So that's a very, very serious wound that he carried for the rest of his life, and it was used against him by his enemies.
It was, yeah. Accusations of cowardice came up time and time again, and that was, about as extreme of an accusation as you could levy in the 18th century. As we were talking about earlier, the system of Virginia government didn't set him up for success. It was a very weak executive. There weren't really, state armies that were available, and yet, so there wasn't a whole lot that maybe he was expected to do or could have done differently under his understanding of the state constitution, and yet a forceful personality like Patrick Henry or George Washington would have responded to that situation differently, because they would have. You
do what you have to do to survive.
You do what you have to do, and if the British Army is marching towards the Capitol, screw the Governor's Council. You do something.
Did you say screw?
I did.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so I think they would have taken decisive action, and he didn't, and that was held against him.
It's so typical of Jefferson. This story is just so rich in so many ways. When Bannister Tarleton took his dragoons up the mountain at Monticello, Jefferson saw them coming with a telescope, and then instead of just running away, which he soon did, he took all of his most important papers and secured them below floorboards, and some of the silver too, and one of his most trusted enslaved men stayed under those floorboards for 48 hours as Tarleton and his troops went through the house. And Tarleton and his troops burned barns and burned tobacco and took horses and carried off slaves. But when they got to the house, Tarleton said, "No, it's too beautiful. We're not going to mess with it. We're not going to damage this house. We will take the wine, but we will not damage it." And that was used against Jefferson too. Like, it would have been better if they'd burned the thing down in some respects.
Yes, I think that is absolutely right. And a similar circumstance occurs when the British troops go by Mount Vernon, and the estate manager at the time basically gave the British troops food. They weren't trading food for the survival of the house, but Washington worried that it would look like that. And he said to the manager, "You are never again to offer any sort of comfort, and I don't care if they burn down the house."
Jefferson then flees away. His wife has given birth to her last child, the one that will kill her. They go off to his second place at Poplar Forest near today's Lynchburg, and he falls from his horse and breaks his wrist. They get there, and then he writes an American classic, Notes on the State of Virginia during this crisis. That's multitasking, Lindsay. Now, why are you sighing?
Because maybe if he had been single-mindedly tasked, he would have had a slightly better experience as governor.
No. We got to stop there, but this is fun, isn't it?
Yes, it's great fun.
And I think we agree on 100%. Jefferson's great, and the rest, you know?
We agree on 90%.
What a treat to be with you in person. We'll do it again. To all of you who are listening to this, go look at that John Adams tribute to Benjamin Franklin. We'll post some other things about this program, but to everyone, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.